Welcome to Dr. Allett's Optimizing Brains Connectors group. I just wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being provided for educational and informational purposes only. As Dr. Allett is also a licensed medical practitioner, we must make it clear that nothing in the discussion, even about labels, is intended to constitute medical advice, consultation, recommendation, diagnosis, or treatment.
I'm super excited to talk about food labels. It's amazing to me how much I talk about food labels in different contexts, ranging from my office to the airplane, sitting in an airplane. And because I think we're all really confused, and certainly I know that I went through a phase when I was at Bastyr as a student where I was fully confused, and now I've just decided on my system. And do I understand everything about labels? No, not particularly, but at least I've decided what I want to pay attention to. So I'm going to tell you kind of my approach and how it applies to mental health as well as having energy and mental clarity. I guess I'll focus on that piece. Sometimes people are like, well, but I have this other health condition. It always needs to be put in the context of the individual. So this isn't unless it, how I always approach food is that we have to have a little knowledge so that we can set up experiments to see if it works for us. And my attempt is always to give a frame so that we can evaluate if it is viable or not. So when I was at Bastyr and we took many classes in nutrition, I was learning all this stuff, but then I was like eating this packaged food because I was a medical student, and I was like, well, I don't even know, like, how do I pay attention to this? And this was so before the internet and like my Fitness Pal, where you could sit down and figure out how much you were actually eating of each food, pretty relatively simple. And so there was a lot of pen and paper kind of thing. And so I remember going to the nutrition department and saying, okay, and we'll just take this label right here because it was probably not very different from the label I was carrying around, and saying, well, what's the difference between total carbohydrates, dietary fiber, and sugar? Because all of those are carbohydrates, but 5 plus 0 does not equal 31. And why not? And I actually asked the majority of the nutrition department that question and never really got a very satisfying answer. And so we're going to go through the slideshow, and you'll hear how I came up with that. And hopefully the other thing on this nutrition label that hopefully is becoming more and more unique is that 3 grams of trans fats. I don't remember what the label was for this, but hopefully we're not seeing 3 grams of trans fats anymore. We'll talk later about that as well. Part of why I wanted to have people think about this is how do we start our morning? And I'm trying to make my slideshows a little more visually interesting. So I just I put this because one, I want to just sort of stop for a moment. And if you're a cereal eater, if you know cereal eaters, like, what's the serving size of a bowl of cereal, right? Just taking a moment to think about that. And then looking at what it actually provides. So I just picked on Raisin Bran. And so 1 cup of cereal. There are a few people who are dieters who have learned to eat 1 cup of cereal, but I think most people eat 2 cups of cereal. For cereal brands, just getting oriented, like serving size, sometimes it's a good serving size and sometimes it's really too small. Some cereals are 3/4 of a cup. Who eats 3/4 of a cup of cereal? I do that like with the palm of my hand. We have calories and total fats, total cholesterol, sodium, potassium, and then ingredients lists. And so we kind of want to just go through and understand what these mean to us, because usually it's just the front of the box that we're interested in. I wanted to just look at another label because I think sometimes to compare it to like real food to packaged food. So these are semi-packaged eggs. You can see that they have a little dye on them, and then somebody put faces on them. I thought it was cute. People treat real food, which usually is much lower in calories and much higher in nutrients, as though it's the same as packaged food. And so, I've had many people come into my office who, think one egg has higher calories than 2 servings of cereal, which, we always want to kind of check and make sure the facts are right. So these are just a couple of slides on sort of getting oriented on some of the issues around labels. So hopefully you have a label in front of you, and we can kind of go through the steps of evaluating so that we can sort of lower the amount of confusion around what are we going to get and will it last us? And so this was always my core question of like, I would have, and it often happened around protein bars, is like I would have a Lara bar and be hungry 2 hours later, or I would have some dried fruit and be hungry a half hour later, where I would have something else, a different type of protein bar, like a Clif Bar, and I would last longer. And like, why is that? And as I learned about nutrition, what I learned, if you've gone to, you've seen my talk on how glucose metabolism and control is really important with protein. So I started tracking protein. And so, the first step when I pick up a label, so the label that I have, these are Rise bars, is I just look and I'm like, how many grams of protein? And then I checked to see, and step 2 I put in there because everybody's obsessed with calories. Quite honestly, I rarely pay attention to it, but I needed to get a little buy-in. So how many calories? That's always just a little interesting. And generally, I think controlling calories, if that's an issue, is really controlling binge eating. Like that covers a lot of it, and because we can down several thousand calories in a binge, and so we're getting small, frequent meals with protein and a little bit of carbs and fat, and that have all the nutrients that we need with fiber, then at the end of the day, we're less likely to binge. We can still do emotional binging for sure, but that's where the calories really impact. So the next step I think is really important is serving size of a container. And so, because sometimes things are tricky. So for instance, potato chips. I don't know about you, but for me, I can buy a small bag of potato chips and that is 1 serving. And I could buy a big bag of potato chips and that is 1 serving. And so for highly seductive foods, they can put whatever label on the box that you want, and 1 serving, it may not be your emotional serving. And in fact, I saw a study that said that the serving size that people emotionally have is 1, which makes sense, because if you find if you catch a fish, like you're going to eat for a long time, you're just going to eat as much as you can because you just don't know when the next meal's coming. Like that's our base biology. Can anybody do controlled eating with potato chips? Just to have a little conversation, type in. And if it's not potato chips, like what is the thing that like you're like, oh, I don't have, like the serving size that I have is bigger than the box. And it doesn't even have to be a binge, but I'm just kind of interested in like what people have noticed, that the serving size is really off from what happens.
While people are typing in, I'll just say that my husband has discovered, quote, healthy Cheetos, which are made with, I forget what brand it is, but they're made with like real cheese and I think they are healthier than like probably Cheetos brand, because the ingredient list is pretty short, but it's still highly processed, and we'll definitely eat a whole bag.
Yeah.
Between the 2 of us. So
yeah. And that, and that like, and that's part of the discussion is like, this isn't about making our diets perfect. It's like making our diets just slightly better and making sure that we know what the choice is, because they work really hard on not, you know, on making it sound great. So like, for instance, it's not happening so much anymore, but for a while there were the potato chips at the co-op that I shop at, and it was fried in olive oil, and I'm like, that's horrible. Yes, olive oil is good for you. Olive oil is not a friable oil. Like, I'm like, yeah, I'll go back to the peanut oil. And so and there's a lot to know, but hopefully we will just get some ideas. So were there any comments on
Yeah,
serving
some other
size?
people were saying serving sizes for grains like quinoa or rice seem particularly low. And then uh, peeled snacks, peas.
Oh yeah. Those are definitely pretty seductive. Yeah, and so part of it is like, again, we don't have to use the serving size on the box, but it's helpful to think about what we're doing, right? And what is our serving size, particularly when we're trying to calculate, like, how is this going to impact us? Like, will we have energy throughout the day? So I ended up coming up with this system because this made sense to me, and hopefully it'll make sense to you. So in all the discussions and the literature, it was like, follow sugars. And I'll show you an example of this. But I was like, what does sugars mean? Because like some packaged food, I put it in my mouth and it said it had 3 grams of sugar, and I put it in my mouth and it was very sweet. And others, I put it in my mouth and it wasn't so sweet. And I was like, I would think that sugars would be predictable, would predict. And then it just bugged the crap out of me that they never added up to total carbs. I'm like, well, where'd the rest of the carbs go? Because sometimes I get like maybe a little over concrete. And then one of the professors up at Bastyr said that the line sugars is a bureaucratic line, that it's not a chemical line, and so I was like, oh well, I don't want to track something based on bureaucracy. I want to track something based on physiology. And so I just decided to ignore sugars because it was not a predictable standard. So then I started going, okay, we're going to do total carbs. Because what carbohydrates is on a chemical level is how much you can raise the temperature of water when you burn it, which isn't really how physiology works either, but it's an approach. So fiber is a carb that, for the most part, at least until recently, we were like, pretty much stays in your gut, goes in your mouth, stays in your gut, bacteria sit on it, and then goes out. Now what we're learning is that it goes into your mouth, it goes into your gut, bacteria will use it, sometimes bacteria will break it down and use it as an energy source, and sometimes contribute calories to us, and then we put it out. But for now, like, again, we're just looking for a predictable way of knowing that if I eat this protein bar, I'm referring to protein bars because it's usually the packaged food that it's a packaged meal replacement. But if I eat this protein bar versus this protein bar, will it be the same or different in terms of how long I will have energy? And I find this to be fairly predictable. So we have total carbs, we have dietary fiber, and then sometimes there's a line in insoluble fiber. And so I just take the fiber away because it's not going to be direct calories to my physiology. And that's how we get calculated carbs. Did I confuse people, or did that make sense?
A couple people are saying makes sense and got it.
Okay, awesome. So then I would take a ratio of carbohydrate to protein, because that ratio seemed to help me better predict how I was going to feel. Because I had noticed that if I ate a lot of carbs, I mean, even if it was a lot of calories, I was going to be hungry in 2 hours or less. And if I ate protein with a little bit of carbs, generally I could go 3 to 4 hours. Like that was something that I could pay attention to. And so like I was like, how much protein do I need to how much carb, and where does that work? And so I started paying attention to that. And so taking the total protein, taking the calculated carbs and putting it over the total protein and taking that ratio made food a lot more predictable for me in terms of general energy. So let's take a couple of examples, because I've kind of gone through a lot of information. So here are some typical things that people come in eating. And so just working with the information we have, there's a few more steps in this process, but let's just work with the information we have. So first of all, it's like, okay, a serving size is for protein for one of these NutriValue bars is 2 bars, because they usually come 2 bars in a package. And generally I hear that people do that. And so we're going to eyeball the calories. So it's 190 calories. Okay. And so we're going to come down here, and it's 3 grams of protein for 2 bars. And so this is, you can see like it's got 11 grams of sugar. And I'm like, what does that mean? So like, I'm just ignoring that line, and I'm subtracting the dietary fiber from the total carbohydrates, which is now 27. So 27 divided by 3 is 9. 9 to 1 ratio. Okay, that's interesting. It's a 9 to 1 ratio. And we'll talk about ratios in a minute, but I wanted to just compare some things. So Kind bars are getting a lot of press, and I just have to say, you have to look at the label, because the amount of protein in different Kind bars varies enormously. So again, we're looking at serving size 2 bars. Actually, most people I talk to who do this do 1 bar, but we're going to keep to 2 bars because it keeps the math simple. We look at the protein, it's 5 grams. We look at the total carbohydrates. This has got a lot of fiber in it. So that's 823 to 5. Well, we're a little over 4 to 1 ratio. Okay, 9 to 1 ratio, 4 to 1 ratio, but looks like basically the same thing, right? Like in terms of like visuals, I think it would be pretty easy for people to be like, this is the same as this, right? I mean, when you're in a hurry and what's on sale, like we do that pretty typically. So here's my current favorite bar, but it does vary. I have a few other bars, bars which were in the newsletter. So Rise bars. So the 1 bar, sorry, this isn't quite the same label, but 1 bar is a serving. And so that's 180 calories. But we get 20 grams of protein. Carbohydrates is 20 grams with 4 grams. So that's 16. And so we have less than 1 to 1 ratio of carbs to protein. So we've gone from 9 to 1 to 4 to 1 to 1 to 1, right? And it still all falls in the category of I'm in a hurry and I need to eat and have breakfast. So again, in terms of going through just evaluating the label, we'll put it into context of eating in a few minutes. Is then when I was developing this process, everybody was really focused on fats, and that fats should be eliminated from the diet, and that they're bad, because this was like almost 20 years ago. And we've softened that position up. I am not that concerned about fats. I am concerned about what type of fats they are. And so mostly I'm looking at fats not for the number But I'm looking at, is it a vegetable fat or is it an animal fat? Having animal fats in processed foods for very long, like spam, kind of grosses me out. It's so infrequent that I see these. I don't even have good examples of it. But when I do groups, sometimes people bring it in, or foods out of Arco sometimes have a lot of animal fats in it, and they're stable shelf foods, and that makes me a little crazy. And then certainly saturated fats, trans fats are also kind of on the way out. A few, I don't know, probably 7 years ago, the FDA and I actually agreed on something, which is rare. And they made the transformative decision to remove trans fats from processed foods for the most part. There's still a little in there, but in large part it's been removed. And the reason why is because the trans fats go into the body and don't come out. Our body doesn't have a way of processing it out. There are studies that show that it leads to cardiovascular disease, it leads to dementia, it leads to heart disease, it leads to cholesterol problems. So the next step is to read the ingredients list, and you have to kind of decide. This is where people really fall on a spectrum on, and it's usually a process. Like people, sometimes they're in the stage where they're like, I just am struggling to eat consistently, and so I'm not going to get opinionated about how complex the ingredients list is or not, if I can name all the ingredients or not. It's more like, if I like it and it's meeting my protein to carb ratio, that's good enough. And then there are other people who are at the other end of the spectrum who are going to get much more detailed about it. What I find is that if you can read the ingredients and they're natural, the people do better. But I also work with people who live in poverty and are just a step away from living on the streets, and getting really detailed about the ingredients list. Then they just choose not to eat. And that's worse. I would rather people eat out of Arco and stabilize their blood glucose than not eat. And so it's really important in this arena to pay attention to the person's context. And so, if I'm working with a more affluent population, I'm like, let's be sure that we can read all the ingredients and we know what they are, and let's make sure the list is short, and let's make sure there's no high fructose corn syrup. And when I'm working with lower income people, I'm like, let's just get food in that you can afford regularly. And when you can enjoy a better job and you are off of the substances that you are, like, then you can, and you have more economic power, then you can make those decisions. But going through the foods that are at a food shelf, like, it is really hard to avoid to avoid high fructose corn syrup and things with just lengthy ingredients lists. Mm-hmm. So context is super important when educating people about this part of a label. Any comments or questions?
Yeah, one person commented that they checked the Crisco label online and there are no trans fats in it, but I want you to talk about this for a minute because I know you have before. When you look at the ingredients, there is hydrogenated palm oil in it. And
yeah,
so maybe you can just address when sometimes the labels are allowed to say 0, and it does say 3.5 grams of saturated, and then there's 6 grams of polyunsaturated and 2.5 of monosaturated, but it does clearly say trans fats 0.
Yeah. So I am skeptical of the partially hydrogenated oils as well. So I'm skeptical that if nature didn't make it, I'm like, let's see that in the food stream for a while. Because I mean, we know so little about how the liver processes things, and it took us 30 years to, I mean, I still run into people who honestly believe margarine is better for you. Like, we have 30 years of that education. And so to me, Crisco is synthetic, and yeah, it might make our foods fluffier and lighter and all those things. And and again, this is where you have to decide where you're at. I have one friend, and she is so detailed about her diet, and she loves baking pies, and she's just like, I don't care, I'm making pies with Crisco. And like, that's fair. That's totally fair, right? We each get to make our own decisions. What I care about is that people are educated, that we know trans fats was a problem. We know that partially hydrogenated oils can be a problem. The research is not completely out about them, and we're just doing a mass experiment, because the problem is they can do a study for 6 weeks on something and say it doesn't have an impact, but what about 6 years, or what about in a 6-year-old, or what about for 30 years or a lifetime? Like, then is there a difference? And again, you have to look at the bigger context, right? It's something that I think the individual needs to work with. What I find on a mental health level, well, we'll talk about this a little more, is like watching the sugars and putting more real foods in the diet, and then the highly processed foods that have partially hydrogenated oils seem to fall out. So, like, mostly I just push real foods, and the not so real foods kind of go away. And I think that's generally a better approach. There's a few things that I will actively take out of people's diets, but so thinking about the ingredients list, the other thing on the ingredients list that is kind of around choice is the artificial sugars and the sugar alcohols, and we will look at a couple of labels about that. But you can have like staying with the protein bars, you can have a protein bar that has 30 grams of protein in it, and when you look at the sugars or the carbohydrates, it's really low because it's all artificial sugars. And for me, and again, like, I always do this in context of the individual, but I often will encourage an experiment with another protein bar if they're using artificial sugars, because I don't like tricking the body. And the research on diet soda shows that diet soda increases cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and kidney disease at virtually the same rates as just sugar soda. The difference is the weight gain is not as great. And so, and how I explain that is, and what I have seen on an individual level is that if you smell sugar or taste sugar, your body's going to assume that you're going to get sugar, because for hundreds of thousands of years that has been true. And so when you smell sugar and taste sugar and there's no sugar, your body's still going to behave as though there's sugar coming in, and will get an insulin hit. And there's probably other mechanisms that are triggered that we're just beginning to figure out. And so insulin in itself is a hormone that can be pretty problematic in terms of contributing to diabetes and cardiovascular disease and kidney disease, because too much exposure to insulin, the cells become insulin resistant. And so I like people to get real foods in. Then what is it? Where's its place in your diet? Is it a snack? Is it a meal? Is it a condiment? Is it entertainment? And let's be real. Let's start teaching people that we're connecting to that some foods we call foods are really just mouth entertainment, right? They're not serving a nutritional need. And that's okay. Like, we all have mouth entertainment, but that's not part of our nutrient list. So going back to the Rise bar, so for instance, a Rise bar, like on days that I know that I'm going to miss lunch or not get an adequate lunch, this is a meal replacement. Do I do it every day? No, I don't do it every day. But it's nice to have something that's 280 calories, lots of protein, 2-to-1 carb. I like the taste, but I don't like the taste so much that I just want to eat it because it doesn't taste like a candy bar. So this is a nice meal replacement. It's also a snack because it's stable enough as a bar that I just open it up and I'll clip off a quarter of it and get 5 grams of protein. And when I'm driving somewhere and I need a snack, and then I just leave the bar in there, and it usually takes me a week to eat it, and it's fine. So, and it doesn't get dehydrated, and it's functional, and it sits in my car just fine. So there's that piece. Do you like the taste? Like, I think it's really important to eat food that you like. And I also think it's really important to eat food that you don't like so much, right? Like, I mean, because certainly if there's enough sugar, fat, and salt to it, like, it'll just get into our dopamine pathways and we will get an addiction going. So, it's finding that balance point. So I just want to go through some labels so that we can practice going through this. So I thought we would start with cottage cheese. Cottage cheese, I find, is a great protein snack. People often use it as a snack, and part of the reason is that for a half cup, there's 13 grams of protein. So like a large spoonful, like even if you got a quarter cup, that's 6 grams. That's a decent snack. There's a little carbohydrates in it because of the lactose. So for me, 1-to-1 to 3-to-1 is a food ratio. 4-to-1 to 6-to-1 is generally dessert, and anything above 6-to-1 is going to be dessert. So going back to the granola bars, like the first granola bar we looked at really is dessert because it's carbohydrates and fiber and not enough protein to sustain us. So cottage cheese is nice because it's less than 1-to-1 ratio, so we can add, sometimes people want to add a little fruit to it or add a little fiber to it and bulk it up that way, but it's a nice snack, and sometimes it makes a good meal for people. I'm skeptical about dairy. So dairy in terms of cheese and milk I don't find particularly useful. Generally, in terms of protein sources, cottage cheese and yogurt seem to do better in my client bases than milk and cheese. I was talking to a nutritionist who specializes in mental health or has a large practice in mental health, and what she finds is that if she just eliminates dairy, the depression gets better. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting. I wonder if there's just a subgroup of people who don't do well with dairy and so are depressed. And so we've found a solution for those people, for that subgroup of people, but we just name it differently. So I'm just putting it out there and kind of chewing on that. So I do like it as a protein source. I didn't want to go too long without talking about real food. And so I just wanted to take sort of a commercial break for real food, because what I found when I do labels groups is that there's kind of this sense that only food comes in packages. And so I looked around on the internet to find decent balanced meals, and it's actually really hard to find food, a picture of a decent balanced meal. I might have to start taking pictures with my iPhone and see if I can become a decent photographer. But this was a picture that I was like, oh, there's some balance to this plate in that we've got 2 eggs, and each egg has about 7 grams of protein and really good fats. So if people don't know that the fats in egg yolks are awesome for your body as well as your brain. I like egg yolks in people's lives because it supports the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which helps us visualize things in our head. So like if I asked you what the color of your car is, you could tell me, and if we were in a room together, you could point to the color that it is and say it's a little a little darker or lighter than that. That's acetylcholine. So super helpful with that. And then it looks like we have sort of like about a 2-to-1 carb source. So I would say the bread is a carb source, and then it looks like there's like a Swedish pancake underneath what's maybe the mushrooms. And I think this is a hummus thing, the lines on the side. So that's a sort of a protein, fiber, fat. And then if we got some green things, I would love the green to be twice that size in terms of just looking for a good meal. But like, it's a great place to start. And we got tomatoes, so we got some red, and then we got some mushrooms, and mushrooms are super healthy. So like overall, like this is an awesome meal, and it kind of depends on what your health goals and what your standards are on, like, some people are like, I just want to get in 1 cup of green, and so every day, and so this would be a great start. And other people are trying to get what I think is 3 cups of greens. And so anyway, slight commercial on what a plate can look like. So back to labels. For a long time, I really bad-mouthed macaroni and cheese, and because people thought that there was real value in it, and people like it, and then I started working with this low-income population, and I had somebody take me through a grocery store so that we could come up with a list of highly processed foods, quick, that are affordable for somebody who's looking to increase their protein, because they're going to have to buy it. They can't get it out of most food shelves. And the macaroni and cheese was like 99 cents a box, and I made some comments, and I picked it up, and I'm like, whoa, 9 grams of protein for a serving, and a serving is a cup, and most people are going to eat 2 cups of macaroni and cheese. I'm like, whoa, that's like real protein. And so I started reading the ingredients list, and check this out, they've added whey protein, like significant amounts of whey protein. And so and then I started looking at all these protein boxes, and I just happened to catch it. Like, somebody in the government has said, I assume it was a government regulation because everybody did it, added whey protein to macaroni and cheese. And now it's not just a carbohydrate source. I was just like, oh, this is so awesome, because it's cheap and there's protein in it. And the carbohydrate ratio, so if we just do the 1, so 9 minus 45, so it's a little over 4-to-1. It's kind of in the dessert range, but for low income individuals, like, it's really actually very hard. Like, I think the range of what dessert is versus meal is a little higher, just because otherwise it's hard to get it in. And so again, those ratios need to sort of be for what your goals are and what is viable. So people who are almost diabetic or leaning into diabetic want to come down, but sometimes they've been eating 6-to-1, and coming down to 4-to-1 is a step forward. So there's a lot of context that has to be put onto this. But I was like, this is awesome because macaroni and cheese with some peas and maybe some skipjack tuna. I always try and get people to go to Trader Joe's and get skipjack tuna instead of albacore tuna, because albacore has a lot of mercury in it and that lowers intelligence levels. And they're like, well, women who are going to have children shouldn't eat more than 1 can a month. And I'm like, well, for the rest of us who are not going to bear children for the rest of our lives, probably shouldn't eat it because it helps with form dementia. So skipjack tuna, add that. But really, I'll take any kind of tuna if it helps people get off of addictions, because that's going to kill them first. But it's a cheap meal that they can get a lot in and they enjoy it. So you know, it's really worth reading the labels, because sometimes it's kind of shocking what is there. So Builder protein bars is another popular. We got 20 grams of protein. The serving size is 1 bar. We got 30 grams minus 3, so 27. So it's a little more than a 1-to-1. Oh, insoluble. So we got 4 grams of protein. So 26. So, you know, almost a 1-to-1 ratio. But here's an example of lots and lots of ingredients. And a lot of them are vitamins, you know, so as you get down here, it's a lot of vitamins. You know, like this is a good bar. A lot of people do well in it. There's some people that when we move to more whole foods, it does better. There are some people who this is such a step in the right direction that this is awesome. More than about 20 grams of protein. I had somebody coming in and eating 2 of these for a meal, and that's 40 grams of protein. Most people, unless you're a really heavy exerciser, are not going to absorb that much protein in a meal. And so you know, the absorption is about 20 grams is what I see in the literature and what I see functionally in the clinic. There are some people who can absorb more than that. If you get more than that in your diet, it's just going to go to fat tissue. So periodically I have men come in who are like, oh, I get plenty of protein. I eat a 10-ounce steak every night for dinner, most nights for dinner. I'm like, that's awesome. 3 of those ounces are going to your metabolism and 7 of those ounces are going to fat tissue. They're like, oh. And I'm like, cut it up, you know, have take homes. So this is a bar. This comes out of Costco, and so a lot of people really like it because it's chocolate. It tastes like chocolate. Here's the label, and people get seduced. Here's that 3 grams of sugar, right? So I've had people come in and they're like, oh, this is you know, it's a 1-to-7 ratio of sugar to protein, because they want you to, you know, think about it that way. But when we come to the label, it's still, so the serving size, going through the routine, serving size, calories. So protein 21 grams, total carbohydrate 17 minus the fiber, so 15. It's less than a 1-to-1 for sure. It's not 3-to-1. But check this out. There's 4 grams of alcohol sugars. And alcohol sugars, the sucralose is one of the words that you're looking for. So the alcohol sugars are sugars that you can absorb, but the bacteria in your gut can't absorb. And sometimes they cause a lot of GI distress. And it makes things, and you can see at least they name that, you know, that gives you a warning. Sometimes they don't label that alcohol sugars cause GI distress. And certainly I've had a number of people who come in who think that they have some kind of gastrointestinal disease, and really what they have is an inappropriate food in their food stream. And so it can cause GI distress, but it also makes the substance that you're eating taste sweeter than it is, and you're going to get an insulin hit. And as you get a higher insulin hit, then the calories that are in your bloodstream are going to be swept into cells faster, and then you're going to get hungry or anxious or irritable, and then you're going to eat again, or binge again, or label yourself as having emotional problems when it was in your food stream. This is one of our last slides, and so again, trying to find what do people think about the carb to protein ratio in this burger, or the refined carb to protein ratio? Like, what would you eyeball it to be? So to me, this looks like, I would say probably, so I don't count vegetables as carbs. They technically are carbs, but because it's so important that we have it in their diet, to me, it's a different food category all in itself. And so in terms of vegetables, I'm always trying to get 3, a little more green than color over the course of the week. Usually a salad covers that, but I don't count that as a carb source. Now fruits I do, but I get to have one fruit serving that counts as sort of my fruit and vegetable. But sometimes my internal committee is like, hey, we can eat lots of fruit, and it doesn't count. And that's true, and I've seen people gain a lot of weight with that thinking. So we're going to set aside the awesome vegetables that are on this. And it looks to me like probably the carbs are 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio. A lot of burgers, particularly burgers at the lower end of the income spectrum, really are 4-to-1 carbs. Like, there's a lot more bun than there is meat. And so it's worth kind of eyeballing that. If somebody was looking to cut back their carbs because they're carb sensitive in terms of mental health, or they're just trying to maintain weight, like pulling that bun off and doing it as an open faced. As somebody who's gluten-free, I go to restaurants all the time, and I like burgers, and I'll order a burger, and I'll just have them just give it to me on the plate as is, or if they're really sophisticated, in a lettuce wrap. And people, at least in Seattle, are getting pretty comfortable with that. One of the words that I use is I want a deconstructed burger. And so they give me the burger and they give me the sauces, and then I get to add them as I want. And it's kind of fun, and good chefs will make it very visually appealing. The other thing that's sometimes helpful when people are trying to get curious about, like, how does food affect their energy and mental clarity is just for a week to go get the nutritional values of foods. I'm not a fan of calorie counting. I think that I would rather have people do that intuitively. Our body actually is pretty good at counting calories. It doesn't like to cut back on calories, so the research value shows that if people do like MyFitnessPal or nutritional data on a regular basis, that they get into that ballpark. But and I have people will do that for weight loss just so that they learn what their foods are, but mostly I'm having them look at their nutritional value. And when you move the focus from calories to nutritional value, people get, one, there tends to be a lot more curiosity, and two, I'll have people do sort of semi-processed food days versus real food days, and they're just blown away by how many more nutrients they get. And so, Google's pretty good. Like, if you want to know what's in an egg, you can just Google MyFitnessPal. You can get on without it's free, and nutritional data is good as well. I always like to put a plug in for the world's healthiest food at whfoods.org. George, and I can never say his last name, has put together a really interesting website on like the nutritional value of tomatoes and figs and like how they're supportive for your health. And it's a great website of like, oh, because we learn that like Raisin Bran is good for your health because it's high in fiber. But boy, like when you look at real foods and how much fiber is in it, like eat an apple, right? And we just don't, we're so distracted by the ads that we're not educating ourselves on what the value of real food is. And so that's partly why I'm kind of highlighting real foods in the newsletter. So play with this website. It's awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. I bit my tongue on the partially hydrogenated oil. Have you heard my little spiel? Just really quickly.
No.
Endrin is a carcinogenic compound that is used to initiate the hydrogenation process. And the difference is just whether they stop that process part way, i.e. partially hydrogenated or fully hydrogenated. And it is left in food in trace amounts. And years ago, when everything had partially or trans fats in it and no one knew that was so bad, I was having really inconsistent results with what I was eating and I couldn't figure it out. This was when I lived in North Carolina. And so I did this huge blood test thing, the ELISA test, I think, ELISA Act.
Yeah.
And Endrin came up and I was like, what the hell is Endrin and how am I eating it? And I am allergic to Endrin, even in its tiniest acceptable, not a problem. And then I'm like, but this is a carcinogen. Like, how crazy is that? And that was the difference for me. Like some products I would eat and I thought it was just like weed or what, like I couldn't figure it out. If I made things myself, I could eat it. If I bought things off the shelf, sometimes I could eat it. And sometimes I would have really bad hive reactions. And but I wasn't paying attention to the ingredient list saying, I didn't know at that point about hydrogenated oils. And that's my Endrin story. So I think it should not be allowed. Like you can use carcinogenic substances to make food. Like, isn't that counterintuitive? But I was looking at the clock and I didn't want to go off on my little rage.
Well, aspartame is, I believe, is a carcinogenic too.
Yeah. Crazy.
I would keep this conversation and just like, because I like that story. I think that's a really important story to have added in. Yeah.
It's because it also speaks to the labels thing, right? I mean, this was about 20 years ago, maybe not quite 20 years ago, but actually like 15 years ago. But it was before, like, it was back when you could not find things in a grocery store without it. It wasn't being talked about. I didn't know to look for labels. All I knew experimentally was I eat this, I'm fine. I eat this seemingly identical product and I'm not.
Yeah.
But brands matter. So
it
was really powerful.
I think that's an important story because it's happening all the time.
Right.
It just happens to be that